Hello, everyone. Some people watching live, so there's no obligation to kind of take part, videos on, videos off, those types of things. It's a webinar. It's an opportunity to watch live with me, ask some questions in the chat box, or turn your video on. The webinar goes out to about 20 subscriptions. So some of those are whole school subscriptions, some of those are individuals. So as ever, you can watch it live, watch it recorded. Again, we're all pretty much experts at this. So I hope you're well. As ever, thank you for becoming a subscriber. Thank you for also subscribing to the webinar. I have to say, this is probably my favorite subscription resource so far. So I'm really pleased to kind of share the things that I'm learning about retrieval practice. Not a lot of people will know that the first kind of citation of retrieval practice dates back over 100 years. So Edwina Abbott, 1909. So I've got the original paper, so I'm going to read it, and I'm going to put out a blog in the next week or so, my summary of the research. I guess compare to what we know today. Its earliest reference is Ebbinghaus, 1895. You may be familiar with the forgetting curve. So as ever, you know, we've seen lots of this kind of stuff before. Education research is quite limited, and it actually starts to keep saying the same thing. So Mr. McGill, who's a bit cynical, will think, oh, we know all this already. So, you know, be cautious, but research, as ever, it's useful. It's great for the profession. It raises our profile, our status as professionals. And as ever, you know, put your hand up if you don't want to improve your practice. No one's ever going to put their hand up in a staff meeting, but we all know one or two not necessarily engaged with research. So this is the resource. Kind of people that names you may be familiar with today are Roediger, who wrote that great book, Make It Stick, I think going back 10 plus years ago, Jeff Karpicke, Dr. Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Bains, who many of the kind of inspiration for creating this resource came from their book published last summer, Powerful Teaching. But all the things I've read, retrieval practice seems to be the #1 thing that teachers should invest the time with. Now, retrieval practice, for context, teachers call it revision. So it's nothing that we aren't already doing. I think now we know a little bit more about cognitive science, cognitive load theory, memory. It should enhance the way that we teach. So that's my introduction. I'm going to skip this because that's pretty much there. There's some links to the papers. This is, you know, before lockdown, Just Great Teaching I published after visiting 200 plus schools around the world. Give you a sense of what I'm doing at the moment. So I've been to 1 or 2 schools physically this term, September. But much of my work, yes, supporting schools in England, but you know, remotely, I'm reaching schools kind of Southern Hemisphere, you know, South Africa, Hong Kong, Vietnam, South Korea, actually. And interestingly, those schools are looking at, so an international context, but are looking at teaching, learning, coaching conversations, research appraisals, to give you a sense of what other areas are doing. And pretty much most of the UK work that I'm also doing. So I'm a big fan of those things. My workload insights, so behind the website, you know, kind of looking at where people are focusing their energies. Yes, curriculum, yes, recovery. And my fascination with teacher workload, trying to unpick it, seems to be that the marking burden, although it's always there, has been overtaken by planning. So, you know, getting your resources online. And I've got 1 or 2 sad stories. So I've been asked to write another article for the Telegraph about you know, the situation for teachers at home who have tested positive. Are they still expected to set cover? And in 1 or 2 cases I've heard, teachers are being asked to check in with kids who are self-isolating, and parents too. So it's a huge pressure, huge anxious time for teachers. But again, perhaps unnecessarily workload. Anyway, I digress. I just thought I'd give you a kind of state of the nation insight into what I'm seeing online and all the people I'm working with. Here are 2 or 3 papers, not for the webinar. I want to get straight to the resources. You've got a couple there you may not have seen, number 2 and number 3. I'd probably You know, I found number 2 very interesting, where and how to learn. Now, with COVID, you won't be able to do this, but it suggests that teach the kids, in terms of revision quiz, the same material in a different location, different time of the day. So obviously with bubbles and safeguarding, probably not worth pursuing that at the moment. Number 3 on the screen is the limitations of retrieval practice. As ever with research, context is key. And this one's particularly with problem solving. So if you're teaching creative subjects and using retrieval practice exercise, you may want to just look at that research if you have time. And then taking tests without feedback, number 1, and also giving scores. That I'm going to keep emphasizing to everyone I talked about retrieval, it must come without a score, okay? And that low stakes is really good for retention. 10 benefits. So citation, powerful teaching. Pooja Agarwal, Patrice Bains, 2 teachers, academics over in the US, wrote a brilliant book, Powerful Teaching. Their research, under the supervision of Jeffrey Karpicke and Roediger. This is their summary. I just steer your eyes to number 9 straight away. You know, increasing learning loss. I know the reality can be very different to the theory, but I often advocate, you know, cover lessons, kids doing worksheets they've seen before, setting pupils' homework. You know, you often get kids saying, "Oh, miss, we've done this before," but well, of course they've done it before. It's important that they recap, and I think with lockdown particularly, and it. So for context, we're recording on 12th of October. Let me just double check my date. 14th of October. We are. You know, Northern Ireland have just gone into lockdown for another month, and you know, potentially where we might have more learning loss than the whole thing with exams. I think that's where we focus our energy. What is recovery curriculum for you? And within that, what retrieval practice method do you use to reduce workload and increase people's retention? In summary, I advocate we shouldn't necessarily teach new information. We need to help recap to support schema. You know, learning lifelong journey. I know kids are much younger, the cognitive load's very different. So it's a real challenge, and it's probably not one for this webinar now. So here are the 10 ideas. I'm going to go just signpost the research, but I want to go to each resource and spend my time and efforts in the webinar just showing you how they will be used. So as ever, people watching live, ask questions. If you want to unmute your microphone, it's up to you. Otherwise, watch this back recorded. Simple fix to improve learning retention over time. Think about it, your teaching as encode, store, retrieve. I use this process for the curriculum resource I published a couple of months ago on the membership service. And I looked at some old schemes of work and I revisited them in terms of being a little bit more conscious of where I wanted to teach material and get it into kids' heads, particularly new concepts. What core concepts of knowledge I wanted to stick, and at some point later on where I wanted to quiz and help that long-term retrieval. So to support this 3-stage model, here's a resource. So let's look at the questions on the left-hand side. You know, what did you eat for dinner last night? So I've not thought about this question, even though I've used this question lots of times for a webinar. So let me have a think. In fact, we didn't have a dinner last night, so I grabbed the dinner from the night before in the microwave, and it was rice and curry prawns. So I've only retrieved that now for the first time, and I never deliberately encoded it. I've had to use my working memory to try and retrieve it. I've only kept the information overnight, and I've only retrieved it once. Okay, let's compare it to number 2 now, a curriculum decision. Who was the first wife of Henry VIII? So for people watching outside of the UK, perhaps. Catherine of Aragon. I don't know the exact year. I've been really pushing my history knowledge. I've only started to deliberately encode this information recently for my memory webinars. Subconsciously, I've kept this information for 30 years, you know, going back to my GCSE age, 30 years. And how many times? Well, subconsciously, probably lots. Consciously, probably less than a handful. And, you know, the only time really I've consciously retrieve this information is for this webinar. So you got the idea. There's some questions there. Thank you for people with your question responses. So I think it's a good model. So my tip here with this is, you know, not necessarily keep the 3 columns on the right hand side, but it just kind of shows you how perhaps we store information. But you can certainly use the questions 1 to 4 or model on the screen to pose to kids. And you could use columns 1, 2, and 3 at the top as mechanisms to help kids be a bit more conscious of what they know, what they've forgotten, and what they don't yet know. So we all know that teaching kids that metacognition, I am aware of this about volcanoes, but I forgot how magma forms, what it is, what happens when it cools down. And being aware of that, we can start to reach, you know, for want of a better word, kind of higher levels of kind of awareness, learning, memory, consciousness, those types of things. So those are my answers there. So that's the first one. So let's just go to a recap. Encode, get it in, help it stick. So developing the schema through verbal, through non-verbal, through visual, and using retrieval. So bingo quizzes, flashcards, thumbs up, thumbs down, quick question at the start of the lesson, quick question at the end of the lesson, say it out aloud, write it down. Question to you rhetorically, where do you spend your time and effort teaching? You know, apart from actually planning the resources itself, I suspect we spend far more of our time and effort on encoding, trying to get content shared with kids, and then probably spending, you know, 3, 4, 5 minutes here or there, quick questions on our feet, walking around the classroom with retrieval. You know, with the dialogue of curriculum, particularly people watching here in England, there's been a lot more dialogue about curriculum coherence, you know, impact, implementation, intent, those types of things. And I think that's a good thing. So it's making us a little bit more conscious of not just the content to be taught, but I guess with the cognitive science explosion, particularly spreading to teachers and reaching them quicker through social media, the Chartered College of Teaching, research ed movements, those types of things, it allows teachers to be a bit more aware of cognitive science and thus understand how best to learn. So I think that's a good thing, but whether the storage aspect of this model influences the way that you teach and tweaks it slightly. So I think we spend, you know, us personally speaking, more time on encode and retrieval rather than think about how it would store. Transferring knowledge. So if I teach you about volcanoes today, what's going to happen in a month or a year's time, and at what point will I reference what we've learned about volcanoes erupting? I'm not going to play this now, so I'm just going to pause it, but you'll have seen the slides. It's just a little video with a retrieval question. What are the colours of the rainbow? Some of you will have, so maybe in the chat box, 1 or 2 of you, before I give you the answers, do you have a methodology or an acronym or a saying or a song to help you remember the colours? I always forget, but I know subconsciously I've got it kind of half stored. I need to make it more conscious. In fact, there's the answers now on the video. So there's different ways of doing this. I've heard a kind of rap, I've heard song versions. Now, the critical thing here was I need to ensure, you know, for obviously being, so that's the one in the chat box I've recently heard, and I've not yet deliberately tried to kind of store that. But when I pose the question, although I might ask you to think about what are the colours of the rainbow, I don't know if you are. So with think, pair, share in particular, I really emphasise to teachers, force students to write it down first after they've thought about it, or say it out aloud after they've thought about it. By asking for a concrete response before it's shared, it kind of it forces them to think about it. And what we need to do as teachers is encourage a higher response rate rather than Ross or Jenny or Andrea think about this question and everyone else shuts off. So retrieval scientists, they all tell me the same thing. We need to get kids to write it down and say it out aloud. So there's the other video. Now, before you watch this one, if you've not watched this one already, what makes a rainbow? So the answer is refraction. Now, there's a little scenario here, a kid going home from school. It's just started raining where I am here in West Yorkshire. So I haven't left London for 30 years. It's a very interesting environment, beautiful, lots of space, still in lockdown, of course. Lots of rainbows. How does it happen? Now, if a child goes home from school, then talks about it the next day in a science lesson, you can see how you can connect the real world with schema and help them understand, number 4, how refraction happens. So transferring knowledge from immediate, so near transfer, to far transfer. So there's a little kind of research summary here. I want to show you the resource. Here's an example. So think of the rainbow, or think in the top left, civil rights movements. We're teaching kids in history, 1950s America, maybe 1950s UK, and comparing it to today. So that's the top left. As we go through the curriculum to next month or last year, you can see how the topic may alter, but at the same time where we might develop schema and find opportunities to retrieve. Now, physical, I showed you some research earlier, or a link to it, change the location. With COVID, you won't be able to do this, but in the future, some of you might be doing what's called walking, talking mocks, getting kids to practice in the hall before they do the real one. Teach in the classroom next door, teach at a different time of day. All these things help long-term retention. Also, you can include physical on the right-hand side there, the home environment, so homework. Now, time, task, and format, the bottom 3 lines, different time of the day, different type of task, and different format. So I might ask you to write an essay, but thinking of a peculiar example, on paper, and maybe electronically, or maybe spoken. So there's lots of different ways to help develop schema. And I think if we look at the left column first, this near transfer, this might be what happens now. So rainbow or volcano, write me 2 facts about a volcano, write it as a paragraph. In a month's time, write me a fact about a volcano, or draw an assignment, draw a diagram, label the diagram, and then create a multiple choice question quiz to ask your friends in the class. I think it's a really good, interesting methodology. I don't know if you've ever seen something like this before. We've got the blank template. You've already got all the slides. So just think, with your curriculum resources or a particular lesson plan, I think you could use this template as a lesson planning tool. So great for curriculum. Great way to kind of also, great methodology to share with colleagues that you work with in your teams. Just signpost the research here. Click on the graphic on the right, you've got a little paper there, and on the left, you'll see compared to rereading. So if I just come back to the slides, I'm just going to skip back right to the very beginning. Apologies, everybody. Here we go. Go back to the 10. Here we go. All these have an impact on teaching and learning. The greatest is I'm showing you the wrong blooming slide. My apologies. Space practice, retrieval practice. I will come back to that one in a moment. Spend all your time and effort on retrieval practice. But in one of the pieces of research that I've read, it talks about rereading, highlighting, mnemonics, and they all have an impact on teaching and learning, is what I was trying to say, but not the greatest. So this one here on the left is about rereading. And you can see here, initially, 83% of students from this research paper on the right did have better scores, but over time using retrieval, long-term retention, 61% compared to using rereading as an exercise for retrieval. So it's about your, as ever with research, it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. So that banana-rama phase, that's what gets your results. Retrieve rather than read. So quick quizzes. Gaps. Now, I believe where teachers spend all their energy and effort is with interventions. So identifying through your assessment processes and then selecting the right intervention with the child. The challenge is you've got 30 kids in front of you, and as ever, you'll always have 3 groups. The kids that fly, the kids that need a little bit of critique or feedback to then fly, and the kids that will always struggle. So as ever, a teacher's always torn between where they spend their energy. Here's another method. A brain dump, you might call it something different, something downloads or whatever it is, or stop the lesson and something else. Stop the lesson, write down 2 facts about volcanoes, couple of minutes, right, let's carry on, and we're looking at rivers today. So you may have heard of interleaving. The best way to explain interleaving practice is, think of a bowl, a mixed fruit salad, so grapes, melons, apples, oranges, all mixed together. You wouldn't add baked beans, so that represents another aspect of your curriculum. So if we're teaching kids about rivers and whatever else, we wouldn't necessarily want to go into a totally abstract, different unit of work. It's not going to support their schema or long-term retention. So the templates, this is your teacher script. So in the light grey, you've got your own scripts. Essentially, imagine a blank version of this paper without the script, but you've got the dark questions in bold. So you can see my example here is how does a volcano erupt? So number 2, this is all my answers when I actually tested myself. And then I had to go and check. So my sources, textbooks, videos, Wikipedia, History Museum, whatever it would be. And then I've just added 4 or 5 answers that I knew before that I didn't, that I'd forgotten or not consciously stored. And then you can just make a point about the students recording how they're going to find this information out. In terms of this template, I would probably copy, I don't know, what for one term, maybe 5 to 10 sheets, A4 landscape in a folder for kids or at the back of the books, and they all have their own versions, and they build up a bank of maybe 30 of these over the academic year. And if you did it once a week, they're developing a low stakes assessment, no grade associated, but a simple way to record things they know to build up that retrieval. So any questions, let me know. As ever, there's always context. So there's a few recommendations here. What would you do with a 4-year-old versus 16 is going to matter. Always give the kids a chance to share their answers. Writing by hand versus typed up is, so the effects of writing versus typing is unknown. So experiment, then do a formal exam and see what the differences are. But it should not necessarily come with a grade. The retrieval practice, of course, you want to do the formal assessments to see how kids are progressing. So there's one, there's the blank template there. I was trying to find that. So photocopy loads of these, leave them all around your classroom would be my tip. Metacognition. Now, here's a 4-step process. And what we need to do here, here's the question again. So what is a volcano? Put your answer on the right-hand side. So I guess the 2 columns on the left don't need to be this big. You can probably squeeze these up a little bit. You could probably leave the air, unless you're typing this up and giving it to students, you could leave the middle blank. They can record the questions or write the answers themselves. But the method is this. So what is a volcano? Question 1. Put a tick if you know the answer or a question mark if you don't. Okay. And then the kids will start to verify. So answer all the questions, the ticks without your books. Look up the question mark answers using your books to verify if you were right or not. And then where you've written the answers and you put a tick. So if I write the answer on the right hand side, number 1, what is volcano? And I tick. I need to just verify that with a key source. So there's another way to allow pupils to be aware of, I know this and I don't yet know this. And I think if we develop this awareness in our pupils, and the challenge as ever is how would this manifest itself with a 4-year-old versus a 16-year-old who's failed their exams 3 times and needs to get that grade to get their maths. You can see the context is king, okay? So you need to do the hard work, folks, I'm afraid, to translate all of this back into your classroom. Now, I said to watch a little simple video narration. I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I could talk about this all day. And again, you could have a million different scenarios. Now, this comes from my book, Mark, Plan, Teach. Some research by Nicola McFarlane Dick. And you may have seen Barrett Rosenshine's 17 Principles of Effective Instruction, often regurgitated into 10 to make it a bit more easier because many of them can be amalgamated. Nicola McFarlane Dick offer a good 7 good principles of feedback, and here's the kind of loop. So essentially, if we strip everything away, we want kids to remember stuff. We want them to regulate their behavior as well as their learning. So number 1, I say, could you draw a bicycle for me, and could you label as many parts as possible? In this gray zone is where pupils internalize, so we don't necessarily see all of these decisions being made beneath the surface. So 2, kids have their cultural capital, their domain knowledge, their strategies that they will select, and their motivations. They may not like you, they may not be in the mood today, Monday morning, Friday afternoon, poor night's sleep, poor diet, screen time, so many factors, learning needs, ADHD, etc., etc. The student will then set a goal based on all these influences. They will then select their tactics and the strategies that you've provided them with, or the ones that they can use based on the things they've either learned through their own schema, problem solving, that critical thinking, or working with friends. What they then do is then set their own outcome or their intended goal based on those aspects versus what you've asked them to do. The challenge for teachers is, wherever we are in the classroom, we have to start to observe many non-verbal signals. You know, I'm daydreaming out the window, but does it mean I'm not concentrating on the task? I'm chatting to so-and-so, does it mean that I'm just gossiping, or am I actually focused in on the task? We've all been there. We've all accused kids of doing X, Y, Z when we actually don't necessarily know if learning is happening. So the cognition, the motivation, the behavior, the body language, is Ross right, and is he engaged, asking questions, a plethora of possibilities. We have to observe as much as we can. So if we pop back to Barrett Rosenshine research, if you're familiar with this, he would recommend, as you prepare kids for that independent practice, when you monitor this practice, the recommendation is kind of a 30-second walk around the room or a check-in with everybody. So that's what we do for number 7. This hands up if we're okay, anyone there got any questions, those types of things. And then we do a little walk around, pep talk in people's ears. And we use the data, this assessment in and out of the lesson, to plan the next lesson. And that's number 7. So I hope this helps. It's quite fascinating. There's a lot more behind it. And if you want the link, please let me know and I can send you the paper to read. But what I've done is, there's a little definition for you there. I'm going to skip this. I use those to produce a 7-stage feedback plan. Here's another strategy, 2 things. So reversing the encode, store, retrieve. Let's start with the retrieval, storage, and get more information in. I'm trying to think of an example that I would do. So number 1, teaching design technology to 11-year-olds. If we were, you know, hammers, nails, chisels, tenon saws, woodwork vices, those types of stuff, and we were getting kids to make a project or whatever, I might put the tools on the table, put an apron or a towel over the top, and ask the pupils to retrieve a tool that's now missing, and then ask how to spell it, etc., etc. So there's lots of ways that you can get kids to retrieve, store, and then encode further information. So it's kind of developing the schema. So another way of helping this is, right, kids, stop the lesson. Tell me 2 things today about the tools that we are using to construct ABC. Tell me 2 things about the tools we used last lesson. Number 3, what are the 2 things you've learned from this schema work? Number 4, what are the 2 things you still need to know more about? Based on the retrieval people that I've been working with, write it down or say it out loud. Okay, kids, right, stop the lesson again. Say out aloud to the person next to you 2 things you've learned about today. So that's sharing. So you could do this once, collect the papers, do it again, and ask them to write, say it out aloud first before they see their responses on paper. I think it's a really nice little simple strategy. We probably do a lot of these things subconsciously, but trying to do it more consciously to help pupils bring that implicit and make it more explicit, so from subconscious to conscious, is going to help kids remember more stuff, and also be able to retain and articulate and express what they've learned there and then when you're testing. So building up that confidence as well. There's lots of tips here. There could be thousands more. The key thing I'm going to keep emphasizing is retrieval practice. 1, has to not have a grade, but 2, it should be a little bit hard, and that's going to help develop this retention. More research. There's the book, Powerful Teaching. Great book. I'd really recommend having a look. And then some more research about the research that's published in the book about the retrieval practice processes. The recommendation from this research was that 2 days after the lesson, and the more retrieval, the better, leads to longer term storage. So how do you store space practice? Remember, retrieval is the quizzes, the revision. Space is taught you about volcanoes today. Here is the hotspot in the future part of my curriculum when I'm going to quiz you again on volcanoes. So I think the challenge for us all is, in our diaries, in our schemes of work, is mapping out all the content and identifying some of the hotspots where we can consciously retrieve and quiz past information. So for people watching who've been part of the curriculum subscription, you would have seen a scheme of work where I've modeled this. If you've not seen this, just type a quick email to me, support@teachertoolkit.co.uk, and I'll send you a screenshot example. It's quite easy to achieve. It's probably a bit harder. It's easy to achieve on paper, harder to deliver in person in the classroom. So retrieval, multiple times, spaced practice over time, interleaving mixed similar topics rather than abstract topics. Okay, 6, increasing effectiveness. Now, on the screen, pause the video. You'll have seen this in the slides anyway, and if you looked at the resources, you'll know the answer. Which question's harder on this, the top question or the bottom question? Now, the correct answer is the top. Now, but when I saw this example, I thought the bottom because it looks easier. But actually, one, I forgot what an angiosperm is, so it's actually, well, I haven't, it's a vascular plant, but when I first wrote this, I had. But I know they don't sing and dance, so that makes the retrieval and that, for the multiple choice process, easier to eliminate wrong answers. Whereas the maths question, I need to work out the answer, or I could try and work out if these, a quick glance, if A, B, C, D, or D are correct. So the methods explained on this slide here. The first question had alternatives. They're easier to eliminate. I definitely thought that the first one was harder than the second, but it demonstrates the importance of making multiple choice retrieval practice benefit learning by creating alternative options rather than easy options where kids can just opt out. I can opt out of this question, A. I can also opt out of the top question. I can also opt out of the bottom one, but when we actually read and think about it, it makes it more sense. So if you're designing multiple choice questions, something to consider. I've given you a research reference point at the bottom there on the right hand side. So there's pros and cons to everything. As you all know, you'll be very familiar. Not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And again, we just add in an age and a learning need, and then you start to see context matters. Another piece of research, interleaving this time, so remember the analogy. Fruit salad, lots of different types of fruit, don't add the baked beans. So that's my own way of thinking of this kind of understanding of what interleaving practice is. So there you've got the research. Click on the image, you can see the research paper for yourself. So if we were together watching live, one or two people interacting, I would ask you a little tip. So mini quizzes. We all love quizzes, I think. One of my highlights of lockdown teaching my son at home was some bingo flashcards, maths cards. And on one side it had the question, on the other side it had the answer for me, and literally just flashing them up. And Freddie got all the answers, 9 times out of 10 correct, but that retrieval, that low stakes, no assessment, comfortable environment. Right now, back in school, he's doing the accelerated reader program where he's on a computer testing what he's learned about the book. And he knows, although this is really interesting watching, he's getting really into loving reading, which is great for everybody. But he's getting obsessed about getting over, I think the score's 70% to go up to the next reading level. And although the books might necessarily be for an exam and they are developing different schema, he's quite obsessed with the score rather than has he learnt the story or how to pronounce a difficult word. So you can see how retrieval can manifest itself in different forms and also elicit different responses in our young people. So lots of ideas there. Here's the 7 principles, Nicol and McFarlane-Dick. Now, if you look at these, Barrett Rosenstein 17, this one's 7. I think you can squeeze this down to 4 to make it a little bit more memorable. So 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think could be squeezed into 1. So let's just go through them. Here's a good one. Look at me, watch me. Here, I'll do it on the front of the board. Now, thumbs up, thumbs down, 2 + 2. Show me that you understand. Show me your whiteboard. Well done, Ross. Could you have a think, pair, share, discuss X? You've not yet understood this, Ross. Could you think about why this would be 1, 2, 3? and that's number 5. Number 6, I then introduce various strategies, tactics, allow kids to choose, and then I use this data in the lesson and out to replan either what to teach in the class or what to plan for next lesson. So 2, 3, so if I go through this again, number 1, here's a great example, but number 2, 3, 4, and 5, right, kids, thumbs up if you think Y or B or X or Z. And before you vote, write it down, then share it, and then I move around the classroom. Well done, group 1. Excellent work, group 2. Okay, here's the strategies, ABC to that group, 1, 2, 3 to group that group. Use the data in the class to reteach on my feet, reshape the lesson, as well as replan the curriculum going forward. I really love this, and I think if we could squeeze simply the 7 down to 4, here's a good one. Question, feedback. Choose this strategy or this strategy. I gather the data in the moment in a micro kind of section of the lesson or after the lesson to reteach bingo. And I think if we think of that as a methodology, it's a great way to approach good teaching as well as good feedback. So I created this resource in lockdown because I haven't been to a lot of schools apart from people online talking about it. I haven't really seen it live out in the classroom yet. So I'd be curious in terms of how you would use this resource with these 7 principles of good feedback, probably as a lesson planning tool between the lesson itself and the lesson to be taught next. So kind of behind the scenes planning. So let me know, but you can see number 6 there, interventions. All of us spend all our time, energy and effort planning all these different interventions. Remember, we've got those 3 groups of pupils, the high flyers, the kids that need a bit of script, then go off and fly, and the kids that always struggle. And, you know, thinking about where we put our energies and efforts in the lessons, but we often think, right, who's going to get the intervention? We can't give them all the interventions. You know, when differentiation is then belittled, it turns into 30 lolly sticks, all sorts of gimmicks. It can't be evaluated in a lesson. It's probably something that we should consider over a period of an academic year. And how we evaluate differentiation is even a greater challenge. But these interventions are where all teachers spend their energy and effort. I would say the same for schools, particularly when it comes to interventions for perhaps vulnerable kids, or if we get a bit of catch-up funding. You know, whole groups, some kids, etc., etc. And you know, we try our best to evaluate impact. So I think this just little methodology here in 6 will just help you identify your approach in the lesson to close the gap. So a couple of quotes there. I'm going to skip that and move on to the next resource. Whole class feedback. Now, many of you will have seen whole class feedback. 30 books. I don't mark the books. I look through them and I annotate the sheet of paper, and then I use it as a script for myself to provide feedback to groups of students, not necessarily individuals. I read an interesting research paper by John Hattie at the start of the summer 2020, and the research went back to his visible learning research from the mid 2000s, and he said that, in a nutshell, the research wanted to challenge his original findings because there was lots of duplicated studies in his meta-analysis. In essence, could the 0.73 effect size on feedback be perhaps flawed? So you remind us, Hattie and Timperley of 2007, that there are 3 forms: feed up, feedback, feed forward. So I've used this research and these 3 strategies to reshape the whole class feedback sheet. 30 books, I annotate the sheet, I then provide feedback by taking it one step further. Groups 1, 2, and 3 can be identified in here. So I might want to write Ross's name in number 1 with an annotation of what I'm going to speak to him about. Or I might want to choose my pupil premium students or my gifted or whatever it is and put them in a different box, depending on what you're marking and assessing. But I think I just want to take a moment to explain feed up. So you can see in the italics is when you compare the actual status of the new piece of work compared to the target of where the student's trying to go to. So helping them move towards that in terms of moving up the scale. 2, feedback, which is what most of us do. We compare the actual status of the new piece of work compared to where they were before. you know, and that's great for our motivation, great for our ego. We all need compliments, but you know, it can potentially help us improve. I think the danger with all types of feedback is it's limited in its effectiveness because it has to always be tailored for individuals and be very specific. And if we think of we just spend 30 seconds with each child per lesson, you're going to be spending at least 15-20 minutes just talking to kids, trying to provide your feedback, and in some cases probably explain it to them and then help them understand what action they have to take. So you can see I always go back to the same. Teaching is very complicated, and the more people outside of our profession that understand it, particularly our school leaders within it, help support our teachers to make the job easier, but also you know, unpick the complexities and how just this simple resource also has its challenges. The last one here, feed forward, explaining the target status of the work compared to the based on the actual status. So I want you to get to the grade A. This is what your actual work looks like, and this is what we're going to do to help you feed forward. So just look at these a little bit closer. In fact, I'm just going to come out my slides and just show you the blog that I would like you to read if you have time. It's called Power of Feedback. It looks like this. There we go. So in April, just before the summer, 3-minute reads of some really interesting research. Now, let's move on to idea 8, mental organization. If I said certain words to you, turkey, photo frame, microphone, camera, pen, laptop, winter, you've got lots of different schema emerging in your head. We all have different schema. Again, this cultural capital will all have different. So if I say skiing, some of you may have been skiing, some of you might have just seen it on the TV. Some children might not even know what it is. So that cultural capital or experiences definitely shapes our mental organization. So, you know, this research here on retrieval, we need to get information in, but specifically out to help long-term retention. So schematic maps, here's an example. There's the word turkey. You're either thinking of the animal, alive, or cooked. If you're in America, you're either thinking of Thanksgiving. If you're in England or Britain, you're probably hoping that we're going to have a Christmas during lockdown, or you might be thinking of the country if you had a holiday recently. We all have different schema. Long-term storage, what teachers have to do, particularly with the curriculum, is make sure that schema A is correct, 2 is probably shaped better if it's misinformed with misconceptions about students' understanding or through home influences or particularly fake news, social media and television, and that we do help them develop a mental model. So, you know, things like mnemonics, rhythms, you know, tap, tap, tap things, types of things we do in music to help remember the beat, all these things matter. So you need to work hard in your classrooms to help develop schema, keywords, key prompts, sounds, buzzwords, whatever it is, to help students' long-term retention. I'll give you a really interesting example. On the corridors, you might tell kids off for doing X, Y, Z all the time, or you might develop great relationships with kids, and then at one point when they've cracked it, or you know you've cracked it, they repeat back your catchphrase or they start to mimic your voice. You know that they've then secured that schema that you wanted them to have, which is a win. So there's a good analogy for you. I love this method, really simple. A3 paper, A4 laminated, board pen so I can write on it all the time, share it with my friends, show miss. Again, increase the difficulty. Rather than asking always, what did we learn today? Increase it. What did we learn yesterday about volcanoes? Write me a fact. Write me, draw a diagram, write an essay for and against, make a role play. This is a great resource. If it's laminated, don't have to worry about photocopying, keep your costs down, reuse it time and time again, stick it on kids' tables. If you're teaching remotely, lockdown, I suspect many of you are, you can annotate this. So let me have a quick little go. You can share this with your kids, let them all contribute in their various micro teams and Google Classroom spaces. Brilliant resource in my opinion. So please take a look at this one and see if you can use this further. Okay, let's another bit of research here. This is about distributed practice, space practice, and overlearning. So the interesting thing here is, interesting thing about crammed research. There's a great book, I've got it behind me, called How Learning Happens by Paul Kirshner and Carl Hendrick. And they actually source a piece of research on cramming. And actually, this is the problem with research. You often get things that say something different to what other research recommends. It actually cites that cramming can work. And that's what the illusion of knowing is, that kids think they've remembered something because they've spent 3 or 4 hours the night before an exam trying to cram it all in. The research on retrieval, at least, you can see here the blue line on the left, longer term retention rather than I'm going to just squeeze it in for the exam. So again, exams and how it might counteract all the work that we're doing. Do we really want to teach for the test? I know lots of external influences force us to do these types of things, but ultimately, we want kids to develop a love of learning. Ultimately, our goal as teachers, we want kids to self-regulate their learning, their behaviour, and we want them to love X, Y, Z subject, as well as the headaches that come with exams and accountability. Number 9, so COVID, learning loss, recovery curriculum, remote teaching. This goes back to the example I said earlier with my son, the flashcards. One side there was the question to show my son, on the other side I had the answer to the maths question. But interestingly, I didn't see the question as I flashed them up. So this little template, you must have these. I've been using this method for 20 years, designing technology cards with loads of materials. And I'm sure you've seen top trump cards. They're another great example of helping long-term retention. So create yourself some of these, maybe a bank of 30 or 60 cards, laminate them, cut them out. If you have them laminated, kids can write the answers on, or on the other sides. So it's probably, it's going to take a bit of time to create, I know, but it's probably going to be something that you can use time and time again. Another way you're looking at last month, last week, last lesson, again, with the increasing difficulty, right, today, write a fact. Next lesson, right, today, write a fact about volcanoes, write another fact about volcanoes that we learned last week. And then we carry on and fill the whole row across the top. Then I increase the difficulty as well, or I change the task as well as, right, today we learned about rivers, write 2 facts about volcanoes, write a paragraph. So you can get the concept. I'm sorry if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs. But I think also if you spend a bit of time on this and just map out as a worked example how you might use this, I think it's going to really influence your curriculum plans as well as how you teach. And then if you can turn it into a resource that kids can record their answers to, which is pretty much, maybe with a bit of tweak in this resource itself, I think it's a good resource that you're going to be able to give to your pupils to use. So lots of research on metacognition. Here's an example from the research. 2 types of evaluation: students predicting their future learning and students' confidence on past learning. So you can get, I don't necessarily want to read the slide to you, but metacognition, a signpost, if you're not familiar, Education Endowment Foundation here in England, a great body of research and some documents you can read on the importance of metacognition, making kids aware of what they know, what they don't know, and many of the strategies I've given you here can help you to achieve this. I think the research signposts that it's probably one of the key things where you need to probably invest your time and efforts. Okay, transfer of knowledge. Now, I've spent, we're coming up to, let's just check the time. We've been doing this nearly 50 minutes and I've been doing it remotely and solo, and I'll be very interested to know if anyone's watching this right to the end. Here's an offer. If you have, get in touch and I'll send you a copy of my book. So that's a little test to people watching. And could you just signpost, just to make sure that you are, just email me this code, remember your ABC, always be clean. I'm going to say something totally random. If you put that in an email to me at support@Teacher Toolkit, I'm going to know that you're watching this. Now, the reason I introduced this incentive is, one, I want people watching the webinars to engage, but also with this one, I think it's probably a critical bit of information that our kind of retention, our ability to pay attention is limited by about 20 minutes. So the danger with teaching through lockdown is to support learning, I need to involve you in some questions, some retrieval exercises and some activities rather than me just talking to a screen. Hence the offer there for a competition, if anybody is watching this later, to respond, to tell me that you are listening, and then I'll send you a copy of my book for free. But how do we reduce cognitive load in our students? So here's a really interesting book. If you take a child's age and add 2, and this is a very broad rule of thumb, this is generally their ability to pay attention. So if you're working with year ones, so you know, 5-year-old, not 5-year-olds, yeah, 5-year-olds, you're looking at an attention span of 7 minutes, and that's for, you know, and that, you know, what is an average student, I should say. You've got all the different needs taking place. You know, I think read the book to get a bit more context, but I just thought I'd just share this with you. Take it with a pinch of salt, but use it perhaps as a kind of benchmark and go off and do your own research. The things that I've discovered are, we can generally store between 4 and 8 pieces of information, whether it's new or old. We can only remember it for about 15 to 30 seconds before. So if you're watching this all throughout, you've probably forgotten the question that I posed or this saying for you to receive a copy of my book. And if we are aware of how much we can store and our attention span, this 60-minute webinar really should be broken into 3 20-minute chunks with lots of activities where I get some responses from you. So obviously for context, recording this alone, send it your way for you to watch as a CPD session. You can see the challenges that faces if I'm teaching pupils at home or doing online tutoring. For adults, I suspect 20-25 minutes is the same kind of attention span. It certainly is for mine. What is it for you? Feedback box. So again, I just want to give you this. The concept we're looking at here, folks, is reducing interfering information. So limit the dialogue, limit the webinar recording, limit how much information or instructions you're giving. But then when you provide feedback, do the same also. So I'm just going to pause. When you provide feedback for pupils in the lesson, what method do you use? Now, the question I'm posing there is, do you use a script? Now, obviously, we use many ad hoc strategies. We probably don't really think of how we provide feedback. We're aware of feedback, feed up, feed forward. But if I'm providing you with a bit of feedback on your drawing and labeling of a volcano, and I say, this is really good, but why didn't you underline this part? My focus is steered towards the criticism. And it's probably the only thing I'll remember. I've got my motivations, my tactics, all these different things lurking behind the scenes. And it's not necessarily going to guarantee that it will lead to improvement. If I'm naive, a younger teacher, a new pupil, again, many scenarios, sometimes we need to give people advice and direction. We all need a little compliment here or there. It's good for our ego, it's good for our motivation. But if we're thinking about learning, how often does it, apart from, you know, I guess motivation is equally a foundation to learning. But it's good for my ego, but it might not necessarily directly correlate to my performance. So the message I'm advocating here is have a script in place and make sure your script focuses in on key questions that elicit improvement. So for example, suggestions. So thinking in the coaching sense, questions I might pose are, have you thought about doing X or Z? Why do you think 1 works instead of 2? And rather than me giving the answer, improving that metacognition, I'm giving kids a choice and I'm posing a question to elicit improvement and engagement rather than, that's a great volcano, you've labeled this really well, but why haven't you underlined the date? And that's that criticism. So you can see how. A little methodology for just chucking one in terms of developing a script. I'm a huge fan of having scripts. and this is in my DNA, so this pose, pause, pounce, bounce method for questions, or the PIPL, praise, probe, identify, plan, lock. So just play that back or write these down for the video. Praise, probe, identify, plan, and lock. If I go through them again, that's a great piece of work. Praise, probe. Why have you labeled X instead of Z? Is it because of 1, 2, or 3? How could you have done D, E, F? So this is the identify space phase. The students then identify one. I narrow it back down to 1 or 2 things they can do immediately. And then I plan. Okay, we're going to do this now for homework next lesson. Do you need 5 minutes? Shall I come back to you? What are the risks of you doing this? What support, what resources, etc., etc. We identify the plan. So I'll do this for homework, miss. I need half an hour. I'm going to make sure that I take some paper home, and can you give me a spare pen? And then lock it. Oh, before you go, Ross, could you just repeat back to me what you're going to do? So that lock or that affirmation. So praise, probe, identify, plan, lock. Brilliant methodology. And I make sure my questions are all suggestions. Have you thought about X? It's going to more likely encourage pupils to engage with our feedback. So a bit more there for you to read. Less is more, as ever. The challenge is, how do we translate all this into our classroom? So what do you need to do to get started? Exams. So, you know, in Scotland, we know exams have been cancelled for 2021. In the summer, they've been delayed currently by 3 weeks. So let's see what happens in the next 9 months' time. But some recommendation for preparing for exams here. The rule of 3 is another piece of research. Jeff Karpicke, who I've already spoken about, this particular bit of research suggests that if you consciously quiz kids 3 times on X, they have up to 150% retention. Now, with caution, read the research, because with all research, now my head's into academic research. The number of pupils, the location, the subject, context, time frame, all these things make a big difference to your translation of the research. Don't just assume now, Ross says, and he's quoted a bit of research, that you need to do everything 3 times. Please read the paper. That's my summary. You need to just unpick, if you have time, the link, the sources, the pupils. And obviously I'm not, you know, a kind of broad rule of thumb. Most of my research is always signposted research conducted with 4 to 18-year-old students. If you're an adult learner watching, obviously context is going to be key with many of these recommendations. All the sources are here, some of the reference codes in academic space, the DOI codes, as well as some books. Thank you for watching. I know there's lots of information. I don't know if 4 o'clock is a great time in the afternoon. I know everyone's busy, so I've tried a 3:30 slot, a 4 slot. I'm going to try a 4:30 next for November 2020. Let me know if it works. And I hope this is a great resource that you can dip in and out of for the months ahead. I'll be in touch. Thanks for watching, and look after yourself.